In a video a few months ago, I talked about how death worked in Tolkien's universe, what was the definition, how did it work, and how is it different for the different races. Originally, I was also going to talk about undeath, but decided it deserved a video of its own. So in this video, let's talk about the different types of undead in Middle-earth, the Barrow-wights, the Oathbreakers, and the Nazgûl. I want to briefly recap my video about death. Death in Tolkien's universe is defined as the separation of the Hroa and the Fëa, the body and the spirit. The easiest way to put it is that the body takes so much damage, for example, through aging or through injury, that it can no longer house the spirit, leading to the separation, aka death. Spirits, unlike the body, are indestructible, and where they go depends on the race. Men go beyond the circles of the world to an unknown place, whereas elves have a bit more agency, being able to go to the halls of Mandos or to linger in Middle-earth. But as with many fantasy settings, Tolkien's universe also has undead, beings that have seemingly broken the rules of life and death, and are hanging around when they really shouldn't be. However, it's worth noting that Tolkien's definition of undead is a little different to modern fantasy's conception of undead. On top of that, the undead in Tolkien's universe aren't all the same. They don't neatly fit into the one category, and they became the way they became in different ways. So I'll be going through the Barrow-wights, the Oathbreakers, or Army of the Dead, the Nazgûl, and places like the Dead Marshes to explain what they are, and what's the difference. Okay, we'll start with the Barrow-wights. Now, the Barrow-wights were created in 1636 to 1637 of the Third Age. When the Great Plague ripped through Middle-earth, many people died, and among them were the remaining Dunedain in Cardolan, who had been holed up in the Barrow Downs and the Old Forest for the last 200 years. The Barrow Downs were an ancient burial site. Going back to the First Age, men had been getting buried in the barrows there, and this was continued by the Dunedain up until the very end of Cardolan. Giant ancient graveyard? Sounds like a perfect place to become haunted. And that's what happened. The Witch King of Angmar sent forth spirits from Angmar and Rhudaur to inhabit the Barrow Downs, and they became a place of danger and fear. Anyone who entered was either driven off or killed, and we got a close glimpse of the Barrow Downs when Frodo and company bumbled their way through there and ended up the captive of a Barrow-wight. Fortunately for them, and for all of Middle-earth, Tom Bombadil saved the day and rescued them. So what are the Barrow-wights? Well, they're the undead who inhabit the Downs. Tolkien never explained what they are exactly, but he gave us enough hints throughout his writings to give us a pretty good idea. So, the wights are physical creatures. They're old corpses that have been animated by evil spirits, but given we're explicitly told that no one could deny the spirits of men the gift of death, it means that the spirits that are inhabiting these bodies are probably not the spirits of men. They're entirely foreign. Now, there is some debate over the nature of these spirits. Tolkien did use the word spirit rather liberally, applying it to the Ainur, such as the Vala or Maya, but also referring to things like elemental spirits and shadow spirits that served the Vala or Morgoth, and inanimate objects such as the two watchers at the Tower of Cirith Ungol. So it's possible that the Barrow-wights were simply lesser spirits of sorts, from the beginning of time, that were enslaved by the Dark or willingly entered its service, and then ended up as a Barrow-wight. Alternatively, it's possible that the Barrow-wights were actually the spirits of dead elves. Tolkien tells us that the elves who had been possibly stained by the shadow often refused the call to the halls of Mandos and would linger in Middle-earth. Through necromancy, a dark magic that was associated with Sauron, they could sometimes be enslaved and corrupted. The Witch King, as the prime servant of Sauron, very likely knew necromancy as well, adding further credence to the possibility that the Barrow-wights were actually enslaved elven spirits forced to possess the bodies of dead men. Unfortunately, we're not told how one destroys a Barrow-wight. It seems that they can possess individual limbs, so it's not like they need a functioning body. Well, they're literally undead, so that's obvious. Tom Bombadil seems to bring the ceiling down on one of them, and that maybe kills it, so it's possible that if you beat up the dead body enough, it will also destroy the Barrow-wight, and force the spirit to flee again. It's also possible that when the Witch King and Sauron were destroyed, the sorcery that bound the Barrow-wights together dissipated and destroyed them that way. Next, let's talk about the Oathbreakers, the Army of the Dead. The Oathbreakers are, as you might have guessed, the result of a broken oath, a serious one at that. After founding Gondor in the late Second Age, Isildur secured the allegiance of the Men of the Mountains, a powerful tribe of pre-Numenorians who dwelt in the White Mountains of Gondor. They swore to fight Sauron should he arise again, but these men had actually worshipped Sauron during the Dark Years, so when it came time to fight, they broke their oath to Isildur, definitively declaring themselves for Sauron. Isildur then cursed them, saying that they would have no rest until they fulfilled their oath to fight against Sauron. Over the Third Age, the Men of the Mountains would become reclusive and dwindle away. All that we know is that at least some of them still lived in the 26th century, but when Aragorn passes through the Paths of the Dead, there are no signs of living men. Coming to the Stone of Erech, Aragorn commands the dead to fulfill their oath, and if they do, they shall finally have peace. They follow Aragorn and the Grey Company to the city of Pelargir, where they play the main role in causing the Corsairs to flee and abandon their fleet. Aragorn then releases the Oathbreakers, commandeers the ships, and sails up to Minas Tirith where he helps win the Battle of Pelennor Fields. Unlike the Barrow-wights, the Oathbreakers are ghosts. They're men who physically died, but thanks to Isildur's curse, Iluvatar has prevented their spirits from moving on and finding rest beyond the circles of the world. They are described as grey with gleaming red eyes, and are barely visible to men and dwarves. However, elves seem to be able to see them fairly well. This is in line with what we know about the seen and unseen world. Elves exist strongly in both, and therefore can see both better. One aspect that is up for debate is whether the Oathbreakers could actually physically harm people. They did carry ghostly weapons, but Legolas, despite witnessing them at Pelargir, still wasn't sure whether those weapons could bite, as the mere presence of the Oathbreakers was enough to make the Haradrim and the Corsairs flee. There is the matter of Prince Baldur of Rohan, who died violently in the Paths of the Dead, but Tolkien's description of his death seems to imply that it was living men who killed him, and we know that at that time, there were still some living men in the area. As the Oathbreakers were just ghosts, spirits, there shouldn't be any way to physically defeat them. They were doomed to remain until Aragorn actually released them from their oath. One question people ask is that why didn't Aragorn take them further? This deserves a video of its own, but I'll answer briefly here too. The Oathbreakers were a blunt instrument and caused fear in friends and foes alike. They also could have turned on Aragorn at any point, and there was nothing he could have done about it. And as Sauron was known as the Necromancer, it's possible he might have had a way to take control of them himself if Aragorn took them to Mordor. And another thing I might add, no, breaking an oath in Middle-earth doesn't mean you will become an undead ghost, but breaking oaths does have serious consequences in many cases. Isildur did not have the power to curse the Men of the Mountains himself, but in cursing them, he called upon Iluvatar, who clearly deemed the crime worth the punishment. So no, in Middle-earth, if you don't turn up to lunch after promising you would, the injured party wouldn't be able to damn you to eternal undeath. But say you will fight against Sauron and then backtrack? That's a little more serious. Alright, let's get to the Nazgûl. You're probably aware of the backstory of the Nazgûl, but I'll briefly give it again. They were once mortal men, warriors, kings, sorcerers of old, who were given rings of power by Sauron. They grew mighty in their day, but the rings gave them eternal life, which became unbearable. They faded from the physical world, and one by one they became enslaved to Sauron. They would then become his mightiest servants, the Ringwraiths, the Nazgûl, and it was through them that Sauron caused a lot of destruction throughout the Third Age. The Nazgûl are a controversial topic, and there's still a lot of debate about their true nature and what they can do and can't do. While Tolkien does refer to them as undead at least once, when the Witch King is being killed, his flesh is described as undead, but this can be a little misleading. Tolkien's use of the word undead is not the same as the modern usage of the word, where someone that is dead is still animate due to one reason or another. But going by the rules of Tolkien's universe, the Nazgûl are not undead in that sense. They're alive, they have never died, but they should be dead, and are only being kept alive by the existence of their rings of power. You see, men are not supposed to be immortal, and as the Nazgûl found out, the rings don't actually give you extra life. They just stretch your current life out until things start going wrong. By going wrong, I mean that the Nazgûl's physical bodies faded from the physical world, but it's important to note that they still have bodies. Frodo sees this when he puts on the One Ring. The Nazgûl are still capable of interacting with the physical world and are bound by its laws. They are not spirits, nor are they ghosts. In fact, the best way to describe them would be, they're just invisible. So how then do you kill a Nazgûl? Simple, you stab them in the head. As physical creatures, the Nazgûl are not immune to physical dangers. They're seemingly hardier, they can survive a flood, they can survive being shot down, and presumably they would survive other physical injuries that would kill a normal man. But as Eowyn proved, if you stab one in the face, it dies. There's debate over whether a Barrow blade is necessary. I cover that more on my video about Nazgûl misconceptions. Personally, I'm of the belief that while a Barrow blade helps a lot, it isn't necessary. But if the Nazgûl die, can they come back? The answer is no, at least not physically. We're explicitly told that neither Morgoth nor Sauron had the power to re-embody the dead, but in a letter, Tolkien also states that the Witch King was reduced to impotence, not outright saying that he was killed. The reason for this is that the spirits of the Nazgûl might be bound to their rings even in death. This would make sense, and would explain how the Nazgûl could stick around even after their physical body had faded. So in that sense, the Witch King and the other Nazgûl couldn't be released to true death, at least for men, until their rings, or the One Ring, was destroyed. But no, that doesn't mean that they could just come back over and over again. Finally, I want to talk about the Dead Marshes, the final place that is associated with undeath. I did do a whole Middle-earth Mysteries video on the Dead Marshes, so you should check that out, but I'll briefly say here, like the Barrow Downs, the Dead Marshes are a giant burial ground. But unlike the Barrow Downs, the corpses in the Dead Marshes don't actually seem to be physical. It isn't the case of bodies being preserved in a swamp, as the water came in long after the bodies had been buried. Likewise, Gollum states that you can't touch them, implying that the bodies are actually phantoms, which also implies that Gollum may have tried to eat them. What a guy. So if not a burial ground full of well-preserved corpses, then what are the Dead Marshes? Well, it's likely all just a bit of dark magic from Sauron, a way for Sauron to further secure the borders of Mordor, as well as pissing on the memory of those who fought against him. The corpses are most likely just phantoms, and along with the flickering lights, a way to ensnare unwitting travellers and cause them to fall into the marshes and drown. So yeah, there's a trope when it comes to undead and swamps or marshes, but in Middle-earth there's a further twist that it's likely just one big illusion. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. If you want to know more about the Oathbreakers, the Nazgûl and the Dead Marshes, I have separate videos on them. I have lots of videos about the Nazgûl, I don't have any about the Barrow-wights actually. Please leave suggestions in the comments below. Cheers, farewell, and remember, if you undead something, don't you actually just make it alive?